បាទលោកអ្នកនាងជាទីមេត្រីយើងសូមស្វាគមន៍លោកអ្នកនាងមកកាន់កម្មវិធី Idea Talk នៃសារព័ត៌មាន The Cambodia Daily ហើយរាត្រីនេះវាគ្មិនរបស់យើងគឺលោក Metevi Mark Morstein ពីក្រុមហ៊ុន Metevi Office Kerman ក្នុងរដ្ឋ Virginia សហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកលោកនឹងពិភាក្សាថាតើវិស័យការបរទេសប្រទេសកម្ពុជានឹងជួបហានិភ័យកម្រិតណាស្របពេលដែលក្រុមមន្ត្រីរបស់លោកហ៊ុនសែនកំពុងហ៊ុមព័ទ្ធដោយសម្ពាធអន្តរជាតិប្រសិនបើលោកអ្នកនាងមានសំណួរឬយោបល់សូមសរសេរនៅក្នុងប្រអប់ comment ខាងក្រោមនៃការផ្សាយរបស់យើងតាមអាស័យដ្ឋាន www.facebook.com/withoutfearorfavorkh យើងសូមជម្រាបថាក្នុងកិច្ចសន្ទនាសួរឆ្លើយនេះយើងនិយាយជាភាសាអង់គ្លេសហើយខ្ញុំនឹងព្យាយាមបកប្រែដោយសង្ខេបនៅចុងកម្មវិធីជូនលោកអ្នកនាងបាទហើយយើងសូមអធិស្ឋានដោយយើងមិនអាចបកប្រែពីអង់គ្លេសមកភាសាខ្មែរតាន់ពេលវេលានៅក្នុងការសន្ទនានេះបាទ Good morning to you, Mark. Thank you for making the time for us again today.
Good morning. How are you?
Morning. I'm okay.
Good. Good. Nice to see you.
Okay. Excuse me. As this country is about to welcome the 46th president this coming January, U.S.-Cambodia relations and Cambodia's relation with other Western nations are the issues I'd like to talk about this morning. In recent years, Cambodian leadership has been blamed for most of human rights violations for endangering freedom and democratic process in the country. The EU voted last August to suspend trade preference in the Everything But Arms EBA scheme. The U.S. tried to follow suit despite reluctantly. Cambodia has become suspect in the eyes of the U.S. for allowing China to build a military-grade commercial seaport and airport disguised as investment project. The country is left. Cambodia has no one to blame but itself. The current Prime Minister has written congratulatory letter to President-elect Joe Biden expressing desire to work closely with the new administration and improve relations with the two countries. My first question to you, Mark, do you think Cambodia's foreign relations will be a tougher challenge ahead, at risk, or further deteriorating, or the opposite, as human rights abuse perpetrators around Hun Sen are under international pressure?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. There are the question you're asking is really a major question. It's really the balance that arises between alliances and human rights. The concern, I think, historically has always been whether the United States, using that as an example, will tolerate a certain level of human rights violations in order to maintain alliances. I think that's the dynamic right now that is occurring. Some presidents have basically said human rights are not very important. The alliances are. I mean, this has gone back through American history for a while. And other presidents have emphasized the human rights aspect at the cost of various alliances and irritating various people. I think Joe Biden's position is that he is going to be much more favorable toward human rights, toward the protection of land rights, to stop land grabbing, to try to make efforts to balance human rights with the alliances. I think he recognizes, and I think it's a reaction maybe to the Trump period, that alliances are very important, but so are human rights. So that balance, I think, you're going to see that being struck in probably in the next presidency.
Thank you, Mark. My second question: the international community knows who runs Cambodia, why democratic process backslide, human rights abuses are on the rise, kleptocrats benefit from plundering the country's natural resources. Yet these leaders are left untouched. Why can't the same international community take swift actions to impose sanctions the same way it did to Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela?
I think it can. I think the issue is, the level of law and the level of enforcement of the law. I mean, you have laws in Cambodia, quite frankly, that are very good, theoretically, to stop corruption. You have laws at a national level in various neighboring countries, and of course you have international law that basically could be effective. But part of the problem is the enforcement. For example, in order to bring an action, you have to have somebody who's willing to finance it, somebody who's willing to create penalties and costs for the enforcement of it. Can it be done? I think the answer is really yes, but the question is who is going to do it? The United States historically was an enforcing arm of a good deal of international law, but again, with the Trump administration, I think you're seeing a decline in that, and that means that somebody has to fill that vacuum. Is it the UN? Is it the is it the EU? Is it CETO? I think that's what's going to unfold in the next few years.
Yeah, but just an example, sanction against Venezuela doesn't seem to work as well as one might expect. I just saw in the news today, Venezuela is starting to pump oil and sell it to China. And what
right.
can America do to enforce the sanctions imposed on Venezuela?
Well, a few things are going on. I mean, and I think in terms of the detailed sanctions aspect of it, I think one of the things that I think that's being discussed now is the Magnitsky Act.
Yeah.
The expansion of the Magnitsky Act. I know Australia is taking a look at that, and I think other countries are as well. I mean, the idea is basically that parties who participate in corruption and fraud and are limited. And yes, the United States can certainly do that. The question is can those sanctions be avoided in some way? And as you're pointing out with Maduro and the sale, you're almost creating a black market. An international black market. You had sanctions, for example, that were imposed on Iran. You had sanctions that are imposed on Russia, and still there are mechanisms for the sale of those goods. But it's almost an international black market. It's not as if there is only one market that you can operate, and that's something I think that's going to have to be looked at. And given the international community, the question is will the international community come together enough to create adequate enforcement, or will there, in a sense, be virtually 2 or 3 different international regimes that basically some of which recognize sanctions from the others and enforce them? So I think what we're going to see is increase in terms of the effects of enforcement, which I think is one of the major problems with international law.
Okay. Well, speaking of the Magnitsky Act, progress has been made so far for a kind of dragnet across the continents, modeling the U.S. law. The Global Magnitsky and Human Rights Accountability Act, or the Magnitsky Act. Canada and Britain have adopted their versions of the act. The EU considers expanding it across Europe. Australia, as you said, is reportedly going to follow suit. Do you see this broad legal power, when collectively implemented, will affect foreign relations between nations?
I do. I think anytime any nations decide that they are going to act and enforce the laws, you are going to have an effect. In the basic principle you learn in Law 101 is that you can have all the laws in the world, but if you have no enforcement, it means nothing.
Right.
So I think it's absolutely essential that enforcement occurs, and I think countries are recognizing that if you do not have a strong global enforcement mechanism, either through the UN or through the EU or through the alliances or what have you, the countries are going to have to act somewhat unilaterally and sort of have the courage to step up. When one country does it, others follow. I mean, they're very similar to people in that way. Person stands up to a bully, other people will stand up to a bully.
Okay. Now, you said we have to, make a delicate balance between maintaining alliance, friendship, diplomatic relations, and also enforcing the Magnitsky Act, the law. Okay. If we go too far, then we are going to ruin the relationship between nations. How can you provide some kind of perspective as to how we can deal with this issue, since we have many human rights violation, perpetrators of human rights violation all over Cambodia. How are we going to enforce the law, hold them accountable?
Well, I think one of the problems that I think you're aware that I faced when we talked about the land grabbing issues in Koh Kong a number of years ago was whether the local law itself was effective or not. And when we were looking at that, we made the determination that the local laws were not effective, and so we looked to other systems of law that would be applied in that particular area. One of the principles of land grabbing that I think that have become more widely accepted is that the supply chain of virtually every country does not necessarily begin and end in that country. For example, in the Koh Kong case with the sugar began in Cambodia, but it didn't end in Cambodia. It ended in England. And so as a result of that, you were able to use commercial mechanisms for the enforcement of norms inside Cambodia. In other words, if countries would impose penalties either on the suppliers or the people who were using some of these supplies, you would have the effect of controlling bad behavior. So the analysis itself is not a simple thing. It almost has to be a case-by-case mechanism, but ultimately you have to look to the laws. You have to look at the law of the local area. You have to look at the laws of the national and the community, and then the international laws to make a determination and to balance it, to solve the problems. I don't believe there's one mechanism that will solve all of the problems. I think it's going to require a piecemeal approach with people who are motivated to do right. And I think there is a moral aspect of this that I think people have to accept in order to at least be motivated enough to make the effort.
Do you think a country, for example, the United States, can go as far as to sacrifice, shaky alliance with a country like Cambodia in order to restore, democracy, respect for human rights, rule of law? Then re-establish or normalize diplomatic relations. Do you think it's a good idea?
I do think it's a good idea for a number of reasons. I mean, essentially, you cannot reward bad actors. You cannot reward people who oppress their own people, who basically deny democracy. For example, the concern that I've always had with Hun Sen in Cambodia is you do not have free elections. And if you do not have free elections, you cannot change the government, you cannot evolve. And as a result of that, it simply encourages violence and harm to people. And as a result of that, the international community has to recognize that democratic countries function better. They have better markets, they have freer markets, they have greater wealth, and they maintain their people better. And so the question is at what point can we sacrifice? And I mean that in the sense of recognizing that there has to be a change. At what point can we sacrifice the alliances of a particular country in order to encourage them to change? And I think that is the goal of, I believe, all free countries. And that is to say, look, if somebody is acting poorly, they need to change. The international community has recognized that in Cambodia. They've recognized it in Venezuela. They've recognized it in Russia, Belarus. It has to occur, and it has to occur in Cambodia to to encourage free and fair elections and to allow evolution, free press, free statements to continue.
Okay. All right. Applying the act, the Magnitsky Act, President Trump signed Executive Order, I believe it's Executive Order EO 13818 in 2018. And since then, the U.S. Treasury and the State Departments have placed a number of Cambodian generals and businessmen under the sanction regime. Do you think President Biden will be much tougher or softer on enforcing the Magnitsky Act?
I think Biden will be much more willing to enforce the Magnitsky Act because I think Biden and I think Biden recognizes that the democracy again does require some enforcement. If you do not have an international regime or even a national regime that enforces the laws, it's meaningless. And as a result of that, you only encourage the bad actors to continue acting bad. And as a result of that, you have got to have some mechanism in coordination in terms of balancing and reward and punishment. It's not all punishment. I mean, if countries recognize that they are going to act in a positive way, then sanctions should come off. But I think there's a recognition that bad acts should be punished and good acts should be rewarded. And I think all countries should participate in that.
We have a question from our listener and viewer who wants to ask you, do you think Hun Sen will, be discouraged or scared of this Magnitsky Act?
I think that Hun Sen is rational. I don't think that Hun Sen is crazy, and I think as a result of that, I think he will understand that again, rewards and punishment are in play here. So to the extent that penalties impair his ability or his country's ability to succeed, I think he'll change his behavior. I think to the extent that he sees that sanctions do not affect him, or that he has an advantage in violating it, I think he will do that. I question the man's personal morality with regard to his own country, because he himself knows almost better than anybody what the country went through in order to create democratic institutions, including the courts, including the Constitution, including the international guarantees, including free elections, all of which seem to have been abrogated by his desire to stay in power. And if that extends to the economics, I think the country is going to face problems in the future.
Okay. In the Senate joint Congress passage of the Relief Act, almost $100 million is appropriated to help Cambodia. And now President Trump is not happy. Why American taxpayers' money goes to a country like Cambodia, Burma, or some other countries with corrupt government officials? Do you support President Trump on this particular area, that the money should go to American people first?
Well, I think it. I don't think it's an all or nothing. I think it's a nuanced issue. I think the issue is that there has to be a message to Cambodia and to Hun Sen that the United States is willing to participate with Cambodia in maintaining alliances and good relations. But I also think that it makes no sense at all to subsidize bad behavior, as I've mentioned a few times. And I think the message should be given, whether it's given in some categorical way or it's given in some subtle way, that aid is dependent on good actions, and that those good actions are not simply to take the money and stuff it in somebody's pocket, but to make sure that the money gets in the hands of the people who it's intended for. And those people are not the corrupt politicians. It's really the people of Cambodia. So short answer is I don't completely agree with Trump on that issue, but I think that the underlying principle of the underlying principle of using American taxpayer money to support a country that basically is corrupt needs to be looked at carefully.
Right. I believe there are some conditions attached to that close to $100 million aid package to Cambodia. Another listener and viewer suggested, why can't Cambodia continue to ask China for more money? Why America has to give Cambodia money? What do you think?
Well, as I think I've mentioned before, in some of the earlier talks, I mean, China is obviously competing for influence in the area.
Right.
Historically, competing for influence in the area meant military might, because there was always this sense of war and this idea that somehow somebody was, a country could take over an ideological, there was an ideological victory and so forth. But I think one good thing, not one good thing, many good things of the international economy has been that people no longer are competing really primarily at war. They're competing primarily in terms of economic strength and prosperity and so forth.
Yeah.
So the idea of competition is not completely bad, or it's not completely wrong, but the question is whether it's being used in some way to create an exclusive control over a particular country in terms of their politics and so forth. China, I believe, with its road and belt policy, is trying to have influence in Cambodia, and I think it's doing a good job in gaining that. Do I think it's right? No. I think all independent countries should be able to maintain their independence, and I think the Cambodian people I hope they will make that clear to the Chinese that Cambodia has maintained itself as an independent country and will do so, including economically. And that also means in terms of democracy as well.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Mark, aside from the U.S.-Cambodia relations issues, there has been talk about, I'd like to take a look at our politics here at home real quick before we leave. There's been talk about preventing President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris from taking oath of office in January by having some members of Congress refuse to accept the certified electoral college votes. Can you tell us what will happen then?
Well, first of all, I don't think it will be successful. I think it's virtually impossible that there'll be any successful attempt at this point. At this point, the actions of the Congress are ministerial, and it's really a question of taking the votes and applying. Let's say there is a potential rebellion in Congress, and somebody gets up and says, I'm not going to certify this. It ultimately would be decided by the courts, and the courts have an obligation to follow the Constitution, and they'll do that. If there is an out-and-out rebellion, I mean, Trump says, I'm going to mobilize the military and I'm going to stop it. I doubt that any military commander in the United States will follow suit. I think it's becoming clear that Trump is becoming unhinged in terms of his actions, and I think right now what we're seeing a fringe, and I think the American system, I think, is more stable. I think it's come under a lot of pressure by Trump over the last 4 years, but I think it's still holding, and certainly the courts are, and clearly the Supreme Court is. So I think that I don't think anything is going to come of it other than another sideshow and another attempt by President Trump to ask for attention for himself and to solidify his own base. But to what end, I don't know, and I don't think Trump knows himself.
Okay. What about the idea of a coup? You think it's possible?
No. I think at most a coup at this point would be a sort of an academic coup, an objection to it.
Okay.
But I don't think there's any chance of any sort of coup. I don't think anybody would support it except the crazy right-wing fringe that he's supporting right now. And I think even the Republicans who look to the right-wing fringe for support are beginning to abandon that group. So I don't see anything in that I think there's less chance of a coup than of a coup in right now in Russia.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for making the time for us today, and I always, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I look forward to talking with you on other topics. Thank you very much, and
okay, well, good
that's
luck.
all the time I have.
Merry Christmas to everybody.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Mark Mostin is an attorney practicing law in the state of Virginia, specializing in commercial relations, lands issues, and things like that. លោកនាងជាទីមេត្រីមុននឹងបញ្ចប់កម្មវិធីខ្ញុំសូមប្រែដោយសង្ខេបចំណុចសំខាន់ខ្លះដែលលោកមេធាវី Mark Mostin បានបរិយាយអំបញ្ញមិញនៅលើប្រធានបទដែលថាតើវិស័យការបរទេសប្រទេសកម្ពុជានឹងជួបហានិភ័យកម្រិតណាស្របពេលដែលក្រុមមន្ត្រីរបស់លោកនាយករដ្ឋមន្ត្រីហ៊ុនសែនកំពុងហ៊ុមព័ទ្ធទៅដោយសម្ពាធអន្តរជាតិសំណួរទី1ដែលយើងបានលើកឡើងថាតើទំនាក់ទំនងរវាងប្រទេសទាំងពីរនឹងប្រឈមនៅបញ្ហាឬក៏យ៉ាងណាបន្ទាប់ពីលោកនាយករដ្ឋមន្ត្រីហ៊ុនសែនបានសរសេរលិខិតទៅអបអរសាទរលោកប្រធានាធិបតីជាប់ឆ្នោតថ្មី Joe Biden ដែលគ្រោងនឹងស្បត់កាន់តំណែងចូលកាន់តំណែងនៅថ្ងៃទី20ខែមករាខាងមុខនេះលោក Mark Mostin និយាយថាទំនាក់ទំនងរវាងប្រទេសទាំងពីរត្រូវការថ្លឹងថ្លែងត្រូវមានតុល្យភាពបើប្រសិនណាជាអនុគ្រោះអធិស្ឋានខ្លាំងពេកអត់អោនខ្លាំងពេកទៅលើវិស័យការរំលោភសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាដើម្បីគ្រាន់តែថែរក្សាមិត្តភាពឬក៏សម្ព័ន្ធភាពនោះក៏ត្រូវការថ្លឹងថ្លែងហើយអ្នកថ្មីលោកគិតថានឹងយករឿងនឹងមកពិចារណាពីព្រោះជាទូទៅប្រធានាធិបតីJoe Biden ខាងបកប្រជាធិបតេយ្យភាគច្រើនយកចិត្តទុកដាក់ផ្នែកសិទ្ធិមនុស្សហើយសំណួរតទៅទៀតថាតើដើម្បីនឹងធ្វើឲ្យប្រទេសមួយមេដឹកនាំប្រទេសមួយយកចិត្តទុកដាក់នៅក្នុងរឿងដែលថាពិភពលោកចង់បាននោះឧទាហរណ៍ដូចជាលទ្ធិប្រជាធិបតេយ្យការគោរពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សគោរពច្បាប់ទម្លាប់ជាដើមនោះយុត្តិធម៌តុលាការប្រព័ន្ធច្បាប់ថាតើប្រទេសមួយអាចនឹងធ្វើពលិកម្មឲ្យបាត់បង់មិត្តភាពសម្ព័ន្ធភាពមួយរយៈកាលទេដើម្បីនឹងស្ដារលទ្ធិប្រជាធិបតេយ្យក្នុងប្រទេសនោះសិទ្ធិមនុស្សក្នុងប្រទេសនោះឬក៏ច្បាប់ទម្លាប់ក្នុងប្រទេសនោះឡើងវិញលោកមានប្រសាសន៍ថាលោកក៏យល់ស្របតាមគំនិតនោះដែរមិនមែនមានន័យថាទៅនាំគ្នាធ្វើរដ្ឋប្រហារទម្លាក់ណាទេប៉ុន្តែអាចធ្វើសម្ពាធតាមរយៈការដាក់ទណ្ឌកម្មខាងសេដ្ឋកិច្ចការគៀបត្បៀតខាងផ្លូវច្បាប់ជាដើមដូចជាច្បាប់ Magnitsky ដែលយើងខ្ញុំនឹងបរិយាយជូនបន្តិចអំពីច្បាប់នេះខ្លឹមសារពីច្បាប់នេះបាទលោកថាប្រទេសកម្ពុជាក៏មានច្បាប់ល្អៗណាស់ដែរប៉ុន្តែច្បាប់កើតមានមកហើយបើគ្មានអ្នកយកទៅអនុវត្តឲ្យត្រឹមត្រូវច្បាប់នោះក៏ដូចជាអត់បានការដដែលលោកមានពិសោធន៍ថាបើច្បាប់នៅក្នុងប្រទេសមួយមិនមានប្រសិទ្ធភាពមានវិធីមួយទៀតគឺថាយកភាគីពាក់ព័ន្ធដែលរកស៊ីជាមួយប្រទេសនោះឡើងតុលាការនៅប្រទេសណាផ្សេងមួយទៀតដែលប្រទេសនោះមានការអនុវត្តច្បាប់តឹងរឹងត្រឹមត្រូវដូចជាលោកធ្លាប់កាន់ករណីពាក្យបណ្ដឹងក្រុមហ៊ុនស្ករសរបស់អង្គការលីយ៉ុងផាត់ក្រុមហ៊ុនដំណាំអំពៅនៅខេត្តកោះកុងនៅក្នុងតុលាការប្រទេសអង់គ្លេសលោកបានប្រគល់ភារកិច្ចនោះទៅឲ្យក្រុមមេធាវីដទៃទៀតនៅក្នុងប្រទេសនោះពីព្រោះលោកជៀសវាងការធ្វើដំណើរពីសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកទៅអង់គ្លេសរៀងរាល់សប្តាហ៍បាទច្បាប់ប្រទេសកម្ពុជាក៏មានដែរស្ដីអំពីការបំបត្តិអំពើពុករលួយក៏ប៉ុន្តែអំពើពុករលួយនៅតែមានការរំលោភសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅតែមាននោះមកពីការអនុវត្តច្បាប់នៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាគ្មានប្រសិទ្ធភាពហើយដូច្នេះហើយបានជាថាលោកសង្ឃឹមថាដើម្បីឲ្យមានការអនុវត្តច្បាប់ត្រឹមត្រូវការគោរពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សត្រឹមត្រូវសហគមន៍អន្តរជាតិទាំងមូលគួររួមគ្នាមិនត្រឹមតែប្រទេសណាមួយទេគួររួមគ្នាឲ្យតម្លៃទៅលើយកចិត្តទុកដាក់ទៅលើការគោរពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនោះ ការគោរពច្បាប់ការបំបត្តិអំពើពុករលួយបើមិនដូច្នោះទេប្រទេសមួយក៏មិនអាចធ្វើអ្វីបានប្រសិទ្ធភាពតែម្នាក់ឯងនោះដែរបាទច្បាប់ Magnitsky មានប្រទេសមួយចំនួនចាប់ផ្ដើមធ្វើហើយយកគំរូតាមសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកហើយសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកចាប់តាំងពីឆ្នាំ2018មកលោកប្រធានាធិបតី Trump បានចេញបញ្ជាគេហៅថាបញ្ជារបស់ប្រធានាធិបតីនោះ Executive Order នោះដាក់ទណ្ឌកម្មលើនាយទាហាននាយប៉ូលីសនាយ PM មួយចំនួនហើយនឹងក្រុមអ្នករកអាជីវករមួយចំនួនដែលមានទំនាក់ទំនងជិតស្និទ្ធជាមួយនឹងថ្នាក់ដឹកនាំជាមួយនឹងមេដឹកនាំហើយដែលគេដឹងថាមានចម្ពាក់ចម្ពិននៅក្នុងរឿងលួចប្លន់សម្បត្តិធម្មជាតិភោគទ្រព្យជាតិមានព្រៃឈើរ៉ែជាដើមហើយនឹងការរឹបអូសដីធ្លីពីប្រជាពលរដ្ឋយកទៅធ្វើអាជីវកម្មរំលោភសិទ្ធិមនុស្សដូច្នេះហើយក្រសួងការបរទេសនិងក្រសួងហិរញ្ញវត្ថុសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកក៏បានចេញបញ្ញត្តិដល់មន្ត្រីទាំងនោះដូចជាការហាមមិនឲ្យមានទិដ្ឋាការមិនឲ្យទិដ្ឋាការចូលជន់ទឹកដីសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកជាដើមហើយនឹងស្វែងរកសម្បត្តិទ្រព្យរបស់អ្នកទាំងនោះនៅក្នុងប្រទេសផ្សេងៗបាទហើយចំពោះការឡើងកាន់អំណាចថ្មីឡើងកាន់អំណាចខែក្រោយពីលោកប្រធានាធិបតី Joe Biden នោះសួរថាតើទំនាក់ទំនងរវាងប្រទេសកម្ពុជានិងសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកនឹងមានភាពល្អប្រសើរឬក៏តឹងតែងឬក៏វាធូរស្រាលឬក៏យ៉ាងណានោះលោកយល់ថាប្រធានាធិបតី Joe Biden ប្រហែលជានឹងធ្វើខុសពីលោកប្រធានាធិបតី Donald Trump ពីព្រោះបកប្រជាធិបតេយ្យដូចជំរាបពីខាងដើមថាតែងតែយកចិត្តទុកដាក់នឹងការនឹងសិទ្ធិមនុស្សបាទនឹងការគោរពសិទ្ធិមនុស្សដូច្នេះសង្ឃឹមថាមានការរឹតបន្តឹងក៏ប៉ុន្តែការរឹតបន្តឹងនោះសួរថានឹងឈានទៅដល់ដំណាក់កាលណានោះយើងមិនទាន់សន្និដ្ឋានបាននៅឡើយទេហើយអាស្រ័យមួយទៀតនោះគឺថាអាស្រ័យនៅលើប្រជាពលរដ្ឋនៅក្នុងប្រទេសនីមួយៗដែរបើប្រជាពលរដ្ឋក្នុងប្រទេសនីមួយៗនោះយល់ថាការទាមទារសិទ្ធិសេរីភាពរបស់ខ្លួនការចង់បានលទ្ធិប្រជាធិបតេយ្យការគោរពច្បាប់គោរពអ្វីផ្សេងៗនៅក្នុងប្រទេសនោះបន្តទាមទារហើយខ្លាំងឡើងទៅក៏ជាកម្លាំងមួយជួយដល់ប្រទេសដទៃដែលគេចង់ជួយយើងនោះមានចិត្តចង់ជួយយើងតទៅទៀតដែរបើថាយើងរស់របៀបយើងស្រួលល្មមសមរម្យហើយបានហើយធូរហើយសន្តិភាពហើយសុខសប្បាយហើយអានឹងក៏គេគិតថាគេក៏មិនអាចទៅធ្វើអ្វីជំនួសយើងបាននោះដែរយ៉ាងច្រើនបានត្រឹមតែដូចថាកាត់បន្ថយជំនួយឬក៏អីប៉ុណ្ណឹងក៏ប៉ុន្តែយើងដឹងហើយថាមួយរយៈកាលមករដ្ឋាភិបាលលោកហ៊ុនសែនបើបាត់ជំនួយពីប្រទេសមួយលោករត់ទៅរកប្រទេសមួយទៀតដើម្បីជួយហើយហេតុដូច្នេះហើយបានជាយើងស្ថិតនៅក្នុងរង្វង់ឥទ្ធិពលប្រទេសចិនដកខ្លួនក៏មិនរួចហើយមួយទៀតនោះសួរថាចុះលុយដែលប្រុងជួយទៅប្រទេសកម្ពុជាជិត$100 លានគួរជួយឬក៏មិនគួរជួយលោកយល់ថាជាទ្រឹស្ដីគេមិនអាចទៅនាំគ្នាទៅលួងចិត្តដោយយកលុយឬក៏យករបស់អ្វីមួយទៅឲ្យមនុស្សដែលប្រព្រឹត្តអំពើអាក្រក់ទៅលើប្រជាពលរដ្ឋខ្លួនឯងនោះទេមិនមែនជាការលើកទឹកចិត្តឲ្យមនុស្សនឹងដូរទេក៏ប៉ុន្តែក៏ជាប្រយោជន៍របស់សហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកដែរដែលថាលុយតិចតួចនេះអាចនឹងរក្សាប្រទេសនេះឲ្យយល់ថាអាមេរិកកាំងមិនមែនជាសត្រូវទេអាមេរិកកាំងនៅតែជាមិត្តតែមិត្តក្នុងកម្រិតណានោះគឺថាវាជារឿងមួយដែលត្រូវមើលតទៅមុខទាំងអស់គ្នាតែលោកថាជាការល្អដែរដែលថាលុយជិត$100 លាននោះបើប្រសិនណាជាឲ្យទៅពលរដ្ឋអាមេរិកកាំងវិញក៏ជាការប្រសើរជាងដែរក៏ប៉ុន្តែក៏មិនមែនជារឿងអត់ប្រយោជន៍នោះដែរទោះជាឲ្យទៅប្រទេសកម្ពុជាក្តីហើយយើងដឹងហើយថាជំនួយអាមេរិកកាំងមិនដូចជំនួយប្រទេសចិនកុម្មុយនីសទេគឺតែងតែមានលក្ខខណ្ឌដាក់ភ្ជាប់មកប្រាប់ឲ្យស្រេចថាលុយនឹងត្រូវធ្វើយ៉ាងណាយ៉ាងម៉េចប្រទេសចិនមិនដាក់លក្ខខណ្ឌនៅលើกระดาษទេក៏ប៉ុន្តែទាមទារឲ្យប្រទេសនោះដឹងគុណវិញហើយការដឹងគុណពីប្រទេសកម្ពុជាទៅជំនួយចិននោះគឺយើងបានផ្ដល់ដីសម្បត្តិយើងបានឲ្យកាប់ឈើយើងបានឲ្យរាវរ៉ែជាដើម បាទនេះជាសេចក្តីសង្ខេបដែលយើងបានសន្ទនាជាមួយលោកមកម៉ូស្ទីនប្រមាណជិត30នាទីអំបញ្ញមិញនេះបាទជាចំណុចសំខាន់ដូចជំរាបខាងលើនេះបាទយើងខ្ញុំសូមអរគុណលោកអ្នកនាងដែលបានខិតខំចំណាយពេលវេលាតាមដានស្ដាប់និងទស្សនាកម្មវិធីផ្សាយរបស់សារព័ត៌មាន The Cambodia Daily ជាភាសាខ្មែរតាមបណ្ដាញសង្គម Facebook ហើយយើងនឹងវិលមកជួបលោកអ្នកនាងទៀតនៅថ្ងៃស្អែកប្រសិនបើលោកអ្នកនាងមានសំណួរឬយោបល់សូមសរសេរទៅកាន់កម្មវិធីរបស់យើងតាមអាស័យដ្ឋាន www.facebook.com/withoutfearorfavorkh យើងខ្ញុំសូមជូនពរលោកអ្នកនាងឲ្យបានប្រកបតែសេចក្តីសុខសេចក្តីចម្រើនគ្រប់ទិវារាត្រីខ្ញុំបាទហាសានសូមជម្រាបលា